Welcome everybody to part 3 of our Indie Spotlight recap for the month of November 2019. If you missed the previous parts, I'll include links to them in the description down below. But this is a recap video of all the indie games we played that were submitted by independent developers. And if you'd like to submit a game for a future stream, please don't hesitate to get in touch. But we are beginning with the game Earth Knight. And this is a game that was built, I think, for the Switch as well as the PC, although it does have some major mobile elements to it, specifically in the fact that this is an endless runner. While the graphics certainly look impressive, the gameplay itself is about you running along the backs of these dragons who have taken over the Earth, and your mission is to collect all manner of resources while fighting the dragons and seeing how far you can get on an individual run. There are two characters to play as, this little girl as well as an older man, and I am not sure what is the real difference between the two in terms of strategy. The girl here gets a free double jump, which just seems like it's the better of the options, especially in a game like this. But the paths on each dragon are procedurally generated. At the end, you have to battle the dragon itself, which is kind of just like a simple mini game, as you see here. As you beat up enemies, collect resources, and defeat the dragons, you'll gain specific loot, which is used for the game's persistent elements. And that occurs in this little shop here, where the major items, which are specifically going to be the dragon parts, are used to unlock new upgrades. If you saw in the previous part, there are a lot of looking like stickers that are floating around. When you unlock them here, they become available in the actual play. This includes being able to do more damage with your weapons, getting a free double or, with the girl's case, a triple jump boost, and other objects. And the general idea is that you have this persistent element that grows the more you play and gives you an incentive to go to different dragons on each run to get different parts for them. And it's a clever idea, and you basically get all your resources turned into water, which is the game's primary currency, and you can use enough water to kind of just buy the upgrade, which kind of seems again like these little mobile elements that we were talking about while we were playing it. Overall, Earth Knight has a decent look to it, but the problem is I don't think this game has enough replayability or variance to keep somebody invested. Because of how limited you are in terms of running and jumping, the game doesn't really challenge or give you different elements of play. And even on this playthrough, I was getting pretty far into the run, and it started to just get very repetitive to play and watch. There's definitely a best way of running through each area, and it seems like the higher you go, the safer it is. And some of the later areas just become annoying because enemies will just spawn or fly around on screen, and you don't necessarily have the means to defend yourself until you get those upgrades. But the problem, of course, is that I don't know how many people are going to be invested enough in the game to play it for that long. It's an interesting concept, but again, the whole idea of the endless runner or an elevated take on runner gameplay just feels very limited in terms of its approach. And with that, we're going to move on to our next game. And that is Little Dungeon Stories. This is another game that was definitely built around a mobile interface first, and it's kind of designed as a roguelite. It reminds me a lot of the Reigns, I think it's Her Majesty series that was on mobile as well. But the general concept is that we are playing a very basic roguelite, one swipe at a time. And the UI itself is built around, for each element you can swipe the card, or in this case use your mouse and drag, into different directions to choose different actions, such as open a treasure chest, break it, attack an enemy, shield, and you get the picture. You can see your stats on the left hand side of the screen, as well as your primary resources at the top. If any of those bars or any of those little icons run out, it is run over. And the idea, of course, is you're going to see how far you can go on an individual run. there is persistence in the form of beating specific bosses or getting certain levels deep that will unlock new events that can happen on subsequent playthroughs. And the aesthetics and overall look of the game have a great element to it. Again, the developers really adhered to this specific vision. The problem, though, is that for somebody like me who likes a little bit more control in their roguelikes and lights, this kind of design just doesn't work for me. And you can tell that this was clearly designed as kind of like almost like a time killer for mobile, for people who have a few minutes and need something to do. If you're looking for a more involved game, Little Dungeon Stories is not going to do it for you, nor was it really designed around that. I could see this as being maybe a good first-timers game, or almost like a rainy day kind of experience, but unfortunately, this one just doesn't feel right to me. Again, I prefer games that give me a little bit more in terms of control and depth of mechanics, rather than just being pure RNG, as well as just not really having any real sense of control over how things go. And I was also kind of confused by how stats work, and what was going on in terms of how gear impacted your decisions. Unfortunately, there's not much for me to say about Little Dungeon Story, so we're going to move on now. And to go in the complete opposite direction, we have Skybolt Jack. And this is definitely an interesting game. It is designed to be a very mechanic and twitch kind of, almost an action platformer. The idea is that we are moving through these levels as quickly as we can using enemies and various color-coded objects to use as our momentum. And while this game may not look it, it is very tricky to play, especially if you're trying to stream it at the same time. The idea is that everything is color-coded to a specific enemy or to a specific button on your controller. Blue is to X, yellow is a triangle, red is B, and you get if you've looked at your controller in the past. And the concept is that as you move through, anything that is inside that blue kind of circle around our character can be punched or grappled too. And you only have a split second for each one to quickly hit the right button to then make that motion. Advanced mechanics include being able to kind of charge your attack, which in turn increases the radius of your circle as well, kind of letting you go further. And you also have non-colored enemies, those are the kind of the gray types that you see, that you'll have to bounce on in order to get around. And the game itself, as you can see, is very action heavy. Unfortunately for me, as somebody who plays as fair share of platformers, I feel like this is a case of a developer breaking what wasn't broken in the first place. And that is delineating out your jump into 4 different commands. As we all know, one of the major elements of good platforming, good action games, is getting to the point where the player is not really thinking about the controls and what's going on in their hands, and just focusing more on reacting to the game screen. For this one, it just didn't really work for me in that regard. Again, I'm not really actively thinking about what buttons are on my controller, and the color codedness doesn't really work. Now, it is great that the game gives you on screen what button you're supposed to be pressing, but this is one of those games that it feels like I would rather do something a little bit more focused in terms of platforming, rather than just repeating the same elements to it. And then you have something like this, where they will split up the colors. Now, I will say that developers did a really good job on the general UI. And you can see as I'm bouncing around that even the position of the buttons, or the little icons, represents what they are on the gamepad itself. But my problem is, again, that if I want to play a more skill-intensive platformer, I don't want to be concentrating on the button pressing. I want to be concentrating on what's going on screen. And the game itself, we played about 8 or 9 levels of it. it didn't really seem to evolve in terms of the basic loop. If you enjoyed what you're doing on level 1, you're going to be doing it way into levels like 15, 20, and so on. I'm not sure there are any boss fights. We did get, I think, near the end of World 1, but this is one of those games that I feel is going to be very polarizing. There are going to be people who love this kind of reflex focus on your gamepad design, but for me, I'd rather have more of a simple control scheme and let things be more challenging in the game design mechanics themselves. But if you like what you're seeing, or you're looking for kind of a more challenging take on platforming, I would say definitely give Skybolt Jack a check. But if this looks like it's going to be way too demanding for you, then you can safely ignore this one. And with that, let's move on. And we go once again a complete opposite direction with interactivity. This is a game that bills itself as kind of Stanley Parable-esque. The idea is we're in the Museum of Interactivity, where there is a giant button, and we are told not to push said button. So of course we're going to have to go and do that. But staying in our way are exhibits of various elements of interactivity as we move through this museum. It's got that Unreal Engine sheen to it, but this is one of those games that kind of is, again, like kind of built on one thing and one thing only, and that is solving these very basic puzzles. The problem is that the game falls into a lot of the basic traps that we see developers make in the adventure game genre, specifically with puzzle design. That we are given a locked door, but we have no idea what we need to do in order to open it. The whole point, of course, is that you interact with whatever is the exhibit in the room. But it's one of those cases where I was interacting with something and I didn't know what I was supposed to do in order to open up the door, because the door itself doesn't give you any indication. A lot of the puzzles themselves are built on kind of this gesture base or kind of like physics guided movement, as you can see as I'm doing my damnedest to turn these valves around. And again, I'll give the developer credit for having like a very interesting take, almost kind of fourth wall break on interacting with these elements, but the game itself, again, is not going to, I think, wow a lot of people. And if you're not into these very basic puzzles, I don't think the story or the environmental design is going to be enough to hold your interest. But with that, we're going to do our quick Patreon supporter and sponsor shout out now, and when we come back, we'll get to some more indie games. And now for a quick thank you to our current Game Wisdom Patreon supporters and sponsors. And if you'd like to continue this discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, linked down below. If you're looking for more wisdom about game design, be sure to check out my latest offering of books, 20 Essential Games to Study, aimed for first-time developers and students looking for some inspiration for their upcoming games, and Game Design Deep Dive Platformers if you're interested in anything regarding 2D and 3D platforming design. They're both available in print, digital, and wherever books are being sold. We now turn to the game Killer Chambers. This is described as kind of a rage-a-thon of a platform or action-based game, and unfortunately, I think it's rage-filled for the wrong reasons. The idea is that we're inside these rooms, and our mission is to basically survive long enough to clear wherever the trap is, or defeat the boss itself. And your only options are to really dodge around. There are items you can unlock by playing the earlier floors on the higher difficulty, but the point about the game is that every room is hard-coded in terms of its platforming and obstacles. These are all fixed patterns. And unfortunately, the problem is that it makes things very annoying to play because you're not really playing the game, you're just trying to follow the pattern. And it reminds me a lot of Kaizo-based design. One thing that is also very annoying is that the arrows, they stick out of the ground for a split second before they get launched. If your character is against that wall or floor that they're coming out of, it's very hard to spot the arrow before it gets launched and kills you. And this is one of those games that is definitely designed around a specific audience. And I would say that Kaizo players would probably be the best fit for it, because it is not reactive enough to really play or enjoy otherwise. Again, you are just basically figuring out this pattern and repeating it ad nauseum. The game also adds difficulty by the curse bar in the upper left, that if you die too many times, you are forced to play kind of like a little mini level to then get back to the regular stuff. And unfortunately, there's not really much else to this game. I like the general concept of it and using the different difficulties to unlock new content. But again, this is a game that the audience for it is going to be very limited. And if you are easily frustrated, definitely do not pick up Killer Chambers, as you are probably doing yourself a disservice in that one. But with that, let's move on. And we turn to something again that is completely different. This is Chromovaders, and is the only game on our list that is only available on browser right now. This is kind of positioned as, I think, like a student project, or it's kind of a very early work in progress. And what this is essentially combining Space Invaders with a pinch of Tetris, or even something like Columns. The concept is that we are shooting these colored enemies at the top, which turn into blocks that we then have to position down below, making, of course, matching patterns in order to get rid of them and build up our high score. We're able to pick up blocks that are already on the ground, move them to another spot, and we also have to dodge the enemy projectiles. Getting hit will force the blocks to move up and those kind of nondescript gray blocks down below. And the idea, of course, right now is just survive as long as you can and build up that high score. There are bonus missions, and the game also features, I think, a lot of, I think they're non-copyrighted songs or songs that are past their copyright date or something like that. But the general concept is pretty interesting. As you saw, we picked up a few blocks and we matched them diagonally. And I'm sure for people who are more familiar with Tetris or Columns, they can set up more complicated chains of patterns in terms of how things are laid out. I am terrible when it comes to these kinds of games, so don't be expecting any kind of pro combos in this piece. But the concept is very well thought out, I think, at least at this stage of it. Again, there's not a lot to this game at the moment. It is just primarily this kind of gameplay loop. But as you saw, we're making those patterns and trying to just keep things going. Another game a lot of people were commenting on that it reminded them of was Medios for the Nintendo DS. But we did play up until the second level, which introduces more color blocks, as well as throws in more enemy shot patterns. Right now, the only, I think, real nitpick or issue with the game is that it's nothing really more than just this core gameplay. There's nothing in terms of growing the mechanics or kind of making the aesthetics or music any better. And it'll be interesting to see what the developer will do with this concept going forward. But with that said, we are approaching 20 minutes in already and we're still not done yet. I think we only have enough content for one more recap video for November. And again, I would really like to thank the developers for submitting so many games. And if you like to submit a game, once again, be sure to get in touch with me. But otherwise, we're going to end this part here. As I said at the start, links to all the games will be in the description down below. And thank you for watching. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. And I will see you all next time for our concluding part for this Indie Spotlight. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoy things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.